The morning sun hadn't fully cleared the ridge when the first camera clicked. It caught the old man mid-motion, his net dipping beneath the glassy surface of the pond, water sliding off his forearm in a silver ribbon as he lifted out a trout the length of a man's forearm, its flanks flashing gold and rose in the early light. Behind him, a line of townsfolk stood 3 deep along the fence he'd built himself 20 years back, some clutching fistfuls of cash, others raising cameras like they were trying to capture something they still didn't quite believe. The writer from the fishing magazine stood closest, notebook forgotten in his jacket pocket, staring at the pond like it had personally rearranged something in his understanding of the world. He'd driven 4 hours up switchback roads on a rumor, half expecting to find nothing but a muddy hole and an old man's delusion. Instead, he found this: water so clear you could count the pebbles on the bottom, and beneath it, moving in slow, unhurried arcs, trout that looked like they belonged in a hatchery brochure rather than a backyard pond fed by a mountain creek. Near the gate, standing apart from the crowd the way a man stands when he doesn't want to be noticed but can't make himself leave, was the hatchery manager. His arms were crossed, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the water with the particular stillness of someone watching a number add up wrong no matter how many times he recalculated it. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. Every fish in that pond, every single one drawing gasps and dollar bills from the crowd, had once passed through his own culling tanks and been dumped, unwanted, into the runoff ditch that bordered this very property. The old veteran didn't look up at any of them. He worked the net with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything, checking the weight, easing the trout into a holding bucket, wiping his hands on a rag that had gone soft and gray from years of use. His flannel was faded, his boots caked with the same mud that had always ringed this pond, back when it was nothing but a forgotten bowl of water nobody bothered to look at twice. He didn't smile at the hatchery manager. He didn't need to. To understand how a pond nobody wanted became the reason strangers now waited at a fence with money in their hands, you had to go back to a colder morning, months earlier, when there had been no line, no writer, no cash, only an old man walking his fence at dawn, the way he did every day of his life, and a sound coming from the drainage ditch that didn't belong there at all. Months before the crowd, before the writer's notebook, before the hatchery manager stood at the water's edge with his mouth pressed into a thin line, the mountain held a different kind of quiet. The kind that settled over a farm too small to matter to the bank and too poor to matter to the gossip that traveled from the feed store to the diner and back again. That was where he lived, on 9 acres that clung to the slope like they weren't sure they belonged there, in a house with a wood stove that did most of the talking on winter nights since his wife had passed. He rose before the sun most mornings, the way he had for 40 years, the way the army had taught him decades before that, and the way habit had taught him since, that a man who waited for the world to hand him a good hour never got one. He'd make coffee in a dented percolator, pull on boots gone soft and gray with wear, and walk the fence line while the valley was still holding its breath, still gray at the edges, still deciding what kind of day it wanted to be. The fence line took him past the pond, though calling it a pond was generous. It was a 1/4 acre of muddy water fed by a creek that tumbled down off the ridge, choked with cattails nobody had bothered to clear, its banks slumped and soft from years of neglect. He'd meant to fix it up after his wife died. He'd meant to fix up a lot of things. Some mornings he stood at its edge and saw only what it wasn't: a working pond, a stocked pond, a pond a man could be proud of, and some mornings he saw what it might still become, if a person had the patience to wait long enough. He'd learned patience the hard way, in places colder and harder than this mountain, in places he didn't talk about at the diner or anywhere else. He'd learned that the things everyone else called finished were sometimes only resting. The town had its opinion of him settled long ago, the quiet old widower up the ridge, the one who fixed broken tools instead of buying new ones, who still saved bent nails in a coffee can, who talked to his hens like they understood him, and maybe they did. Nobody expected much from him anymore. Nobody expected much from that pond either, sitting there behind his barn collecting silt and duckweed, host to nothing but a few stubborn bullfrogs and the occasional heron passing through. He didn't mind being overlooked. Being overlooked had its uses. It meant nobody watched too closely when he did something strange, and it meant nobody was there yet on that particular gray morning when he came around the bend past the fence post his grandfather had set and heard something splashing where nothing should have been splashing at all. A thin, frantic, wrong sound rising out of the drainage ditch that ran along the hatchery's back fence. He set the bucket he'd been carrying down in the wet grass and walked toward the sound, his bad knee complaining the way it always did in cold weather, a dull ache that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The hatchery's back fence ran along that ditch for near 100 yards, chain link gone soft with rust, and on the other side of it he could see the long concrete raceways where the water ran clean and fast, channel after channel of trout fry moving like silver static beneath the surface. It was a decent operation, or it had been once, before the bank started calling and the feed prices climbed, and the young man who'd taken it over from his father started making decisions his father never would have made. That young man was down there now, in his rubber boots and his clean canvas coat, standing over a row of white 5-gallon buckets, with a look on his face like a man doing arithmetic he didn't enjoy. The old veteran had seen it before, from a distance, and thought little of it. Every hatchery culled. That was simply the business. Some fry came out with a crooked spine, a stunted fin, a body that curled wrong when it swam, and there was no market for a deformed trout, not from a buyer's eye, and not from a fillet knife either. The manager didn't have the patience his father had, didn't have the stomach for slow-growing runts eating feed that could go to sellable stock, and so twice a week, sometimes more, he walked those buckets to the fence line and tipped them into the runoff ditch that fed, eventually, toward the creek. A ditch that was really just a grave with moving water in it, and everyone up and down that road knew what it was for and never said so out loud. This morning there'd been more than usual. 4 buckets sat empty in the grass, tipped on their sides, and the water in the ditch was churning with small, desperate bodies, some already going still, some flipping sideways with a wrongness to their shape that any careless glance would call ruined. The manager was already turning back toward the raceways, his job finished, his conscience apparently uncomplicated, when he caught sight of the old man standing at the fence with his bucket forgotten in the grass behind him. "Morning," the manager said, the way you'd greet a scarecrow, already looking past him. The old veteran didn't answer right away. He was watching the ditch, watching those small silver shapes fighting water that wasn't going to carry them anywhere good, and something in his chest had gone quiet and still the way it used to before he moved toward something other men were walking away from. He stepped over the fence wire the way he'd stepped over things his whole life, carefully, without hurry, like haste was a young man's luxury he'd used up somewhere else, decades back, in mud that wasn't Colorado mud. The manager had already turned his back, boots crunching gravel toward the raceways, and didn't see the old man crouch at the edge of the ditch, didn't see him roll his sleeve past the elbow and put his hand into water cold enough to ache. The fry scattered from his fingers at first, the way anything scatters from a hand it doesn't trust yet. Then he went still, the way he'd learned to go still a lifetime ago, waiting in places where movement meant something worse than waiting, and the small bodies settled, some of them close enough that he could see them plain. Curved spines, a gill plate folded wrong on one side, a tail kinked like a bent nail. Ruined, the manager would call it, unsellable. But they were breathing. They were fighting the current with everything a fish that size had to fight with, which wasn't much, but it wasn't nothing either. He thought of a ditch that wasn't this ditch, half a world and half a lifetime away, and men he'd been told weren't worth carrying, orders murmured by officers who wanted to move fast and light and didn't figure the cost of what got left. He hadn't listened then either. He'd learned something in that mud that never washed back out of him, that the measure of a man wasn't what he saved when saving was easy, it was what he refused to leave behind when everybody else had already decided it was too late to matter. His knees complained, getting lower, the old wound in the left one flaring the way weather changes always announced themselves through it, but he didn't rise. He cupped both hands and lifted a small drift of them out together, 6, 8 fry, no bigger than his thumbnail, cold and slick and trembling against his palms, and held them like a thing he already knew he was going to be responsible for, whether he wanted to be or not. Behind him, the bucket sat forgotten in the wet grass, empty, waiting on a decision he'd already made without deciding it, the way a man's hands sometimes moved ahead of his good sense, and his good sense had to hurry up and catch them. He looked once toward the raceways, where the manager had disappeared into the low gray hatchery buildings without a backward glance, without the faintest notion that anything of value had been poured into that ditch at all. Then the old veteran turned back to the water, picked up his bucket and began, bent-kneed, patient, unhurried, to save what the morning had already decided to throw away. It took him the better part of 3 mornings to move them all, though all was a number he never let himself count too closely, because counting made it feel like a wager instead of a chore, and he had learned long ago that a man does poorly when he starts keeping score on mercy. He carried water first, always water, filling the bucket from the ditch itself before he ever touched a fish, so the fry would ride in something close to what they already knew, rather than shock against the strange cold of well water or the warmth of his hands alone. Then he'd kneel, cup them, count them into the bucket in 2s and 3s, and haul the sloshing weight of it up through the wet grass, over the fence line where a post had rotted through years back, and down the slope to the pond that had sat half forgotten behind his barn since before his wife passed, its edges gone soft with cattail and duckweed, its water the color of strong tea. By the second morning, the neighbors had noticed. A man from 3 farms over leaned on his own fence with a coffee mug and called out that he must be feeding some kind of new hobby, didn't figure him for the aquarium type. The old veteran didn't answer, just kept walking, bucket swinging, boots dark to the ankle with ditch mud. By the 3rd morning, word had reached the feed store, and by the 3rd afternoon it had reached the hatchery itself, because the younger manager came striding down to the fence line with his arms crossed and a look on his face like a man watching someone set fire to their own barn for entertainment. "Those are cullfish," he said, like the old man might not have understood the first time. "Deformed, runted. They don't grow right, they don't feed right. Half of 'em got no fight in 'em at all. You put 100 of those in a mud-hole pond, you'll have 100 dead fish inside a week, maybe less." The old veteran set the bucket down at the pond's edge and straightened slow, one hand pressed to his knee the way he always did when the weather in it wanted acknowledging. He didn't argue the point. He never had much use for arguing points that time would settle on its own, one way or the other, without needing his help. He only said that a week seemed like a fair amount of time to find out, and went back to work. The manager laughed, not cruelly, just the easy laugh of a busy man who had better things to do than watch an old fool waste his mornings, and turned back up the hill toward the raceways, already talking to someone else about it before he'd gone 10 steps, the story already leaving his mouth shaped like a joke. The old veteran watched him go, then knelt again at the water's edge, cupped another 6 trembling fry from the bucket, and let them slide beneath the surface, watching the ripples close over them like a door shutting quiet on something nobody else believed was worth locking. The story reached the feed store before he did, the way stories in a small town always traveled faster than the truck that carried the man who lived them. He pushed through the door with a short list in his coat pocket and found the clerk already grinning before he'd said a word. "Heard you're running a charity ward for crippled fish," the clerk said, not unkindly, sliding a bag of feed across the counter like it was a punchline he'd been saving. 2 men by the coffee pot laughed low into their cups. One of them said something about a fish hospital, said it loud enough to be sure it landed, and the old veteran let it land. He didn't flinch, didn't smile, just counted out bills slow and careful from a thin fold in his wallet, the kind of counting a man does when every dollar has a job already assigned to it before it leaves his hand. He asked about aerator tubing, the kind used for oxygenating stock tanks, and the clerk raised his eyebrows like the request itself was the joke's second act. "For a backyard pond?" he asked, and the old veteran only nodded, said the pond needed help breathing same as anything crowded, and left it there. He bought what he could afford and left the rest chalked in his head for another week, another paycheck from the little pension that stretched thinner than it used to. At the diner that evening, the talk had already ripened into something with legs of its own. He heard it through the window before he opened the door, a man's voice, easy and amused, saying the old man out past the hatchery had gone soft in the head, hauling dying fish home like stray dogs, feeding them better than he fed himself, probably. Someone else said maybe the war did something to him, said it the way people say true things they've never bothered to understand, and there was a pause after that, a small, uncomfortable pause, before the laughter picked back up and covered it. He sat at the counter anyway, ordered coffee, didn't turn around. He'd sat through worse rooms than this one, rooms where the wrong word could cost a man his footing forever, and a diner full of soft laughter didn't weigh much against that kind of memory. He drank his coffee slow, paid, left a small tip he could barely spare, and walked out into the cold with his collar up and his mind already back at the pond, running numbers on flow rates and shade cover the way another man might run numbers on a horse race. By the time he reached the fence line, the sky had gone the color of wet slate, and he could hear the creek talking to itself in the dark, steady and unbothered, the only voice in the valley that hadn't yet decided what to think of him. He kept a notebook in the footlocker, the kind with a cracked green cover he'd carried since a supply sergeant handed it to him decades ago, and he started using it again the way he once logged rations and weather, because a man who didn't write things down was a man guessing, and guessing had gotten better men than him killed once. He wrote the time he fed the fish, morning and evening, same as clockwork, because trout raised on chaos grew crooked in ways that had nothing to do with what the hatchery had thrown away. He wrote the temperature of the water, checked with a thermometer he'd bought second-hand at the feed store for less than a cup of coffee cost in town, and he wrote what he saw when he crouched at the bank in the gray hour before the sun cleared the ridge, watching the shapes below the surface the way he used to watch a tree line, patient, unblinking, willing to wait longer than the thing he was watching. Some of the fry with the crooked spines struggled against the current near the inlet, tired quicker than the others, so he cut back a channel with a shovel to slow the flow there, giving them a soft eddy to rest in instead of fighting water that didn't care whether they lived. Others with the stunted fins seemed to find their balance anyway, turning tight little circles that shouldn't have worked and somehow did, and he began to notice that the fish everyone had called ruined weren't ruined the same way twice, that damage wasn't a single thing but 100 small different things, and some of those things mattered less than the hatchery had assumed when it dumped them all into one bucket marked worthless. He rigged shade with scrap lumber and an old feed sack stretched across a frame, because trout didn't thrive in a sun that beat down on shallow water all afternoon, and he'd seen what direct heat did to a creek-fed pond that had no real depth to hide in. He salvaged a bilge pump from a dead boat motor a neighbor had left to rust behind his barn, wired it to a car battery, and ran it in short bursts near the inlet to keep the water moving and breathing when the air went still and the surface threatened to go flat and stale. He wasn't trying to save every fish. He'd learned a long time ago that some things couldn't be saved no matter how much care you gave them, and grieving over that too hard only slowed you down when there was still something left to protect. But he gave every one of them the same chance, the same schedule, the same quiet attention, because that was the only kind of fairness he trusted, the kind that didn't ask a creature to prove its worth before you decided to feed it. The notebook filled slowly, one small entry at a time, and the pond, muddy and disbelieved in, kept its secrets a little longer beneath a surface that had started, almost imperceptibly, to change. The weeks that followed moved the way mountain weather moved, slow and unremarkable, until you looked back and realized the whole season had turned. He kept to the same hours he'd always kept, up before light, coffee black and quick, boots on before the dew had a chance to soak through canvas. The pond became a fixed point in his days, the way certain fence lines and certain graves had once been fixed points, places you visited not because anything demanded it, but because you'd decided, once, that they mattered, and a man who kept his word to himself was the only kind of man he knew how to be. The fry grew, not fast, not in any way a stranger glancing over the fence would have noticed, but steadily, the way a child grows when you see it every day and can't quite name the difference until someone else remarks on it. Their bodies filled out along the curves that had once looked wrong, the crooked spines straightening as much as they were ever going to straighten, the stunted ones catching up in fits, the way slow starters sometimes did, if you didn't rush them, and didn't quit on them either. He logged their weight by feel more than by any scale, hefting a netful and setting it back, cataloging the changes in a private arithmetic that lived mostly in his hands. Trucks still slowed at the fence line some mornings, the way they had from the start, men leaning out their windows to look at the muddy water with the same flat amusement they might have given a broken-down tractor left too long in a field. The joke had calcified into something almost affectionate by then, a story people told about him at the diner without much malice, the old man and his ditch fish, still swimming, God love him, still not dead yet. He heard it second-hand from a woman at the feed store who repeated it kindly, as though delivering good news, and he only nodded and paid for his feed and went home, because he had never needed anyone's belief to keep doing what he already knew was right. The hatchery manager drove past twice that he noticed, slower than the others, his truck idling a beat longer at the property line before pulling away, and though the old man never mentioned it to anyone, he marked it the way he marked weather, a small pressure change worth remembering. The water itself began to answer him in small ways only he seemed to notice, a stillness at dusk that felt earned rather than empty, a shimmer along the shallows when the fry moved in loose, unhurried schools instead of scattering in panic, a silence around the pond that wasn't absence but a kind of held breath. He didn't call it progress out loud. He simply kept feeding on schedule, kept checking the aerator lines, kept walking the bank each evening with the same unbothered patience he'd carried through worse waiting than this, and beneath the surface, unseen by anyone still laughing on the road above, the pond kept quietly becoming something none of them had bothered to imagine. The radio warned of it 2 days before it arrived, a clipped voice between static and steel guitar saying a hard front was dropping down from Canada, temperatures falling faster than the season had any right to allow. He heard it while greasing the tractor and didn't say anything, just went out to the machine shed and started pulling things from shelves he hadn't touched in years. A coil of black hose, a stack of feed sacks gone stiff with age, a tarp patched so many times it was more patch than tarp, an old kerosene heater with a cracked glass he'd kept only because he never threw away anything that might still hold heat. By the time the sky turned the color of old iron, he had already lined the shallow end of the pond with the feed sacks weighted down by stones, building a windbreak low enough not to block the moon, but high enough to cut the worst of the gusts skimming off the ridge. He strung the tarp along the north bank, lashed to fence posts he drove in by hand, the mallet strikes echoing off the mountain in the dark, like something being built instead of guarded. The aerator he wrapped in rags and ran a spare line from the barn, an old habit of rigging what he had rather than waiting for what he didn't, and when the temperature dropped low enough to bite through his coat, he built a small fire near the heater, not for himself, but to keep the metal from freezing solid where it fed warmth toward the water's edge. He worked through the night the way he'd worked through nights before, without complaint, without watching the clock, moving between the pond and the shed with the mechanical calm of a man who had once kept watch so others could sleep and never fully unlearned it. Twice he broke thin skins of ice forming at the bank with the flat of a shovel, careful not to shock the water, murmuring to it the way he might have murmured to something living and frightened, though he would have denied doing so if asked. The stars over the ridge burned hard and close, the cold sharpening every sound, the creek's whisper, the fire's low crack, his own breath fogging in rhythm with his work. Near dawn the wind eased. He stood at the bank testing the water's temperature with 2 fingers, watching for the copper flash of scales beneath the frost-rimmed surface. When he saw them, still moving, still schooling loose and unhurried in the shallows, he didn't smile so much as let the tension leave his shoulders, the way a man exhales after holding his breath through something worse than weather. The pond forgot the cold quickly, the way water always does, holding no grudge against the season that had tried to close its throat. By the time the creek ran high with spring melt and the willows along the bank pushed out their first pale green, the fish had stopped being survivors and started becoming something else entirely. He noticed it first in the mornings, the way the surface broke differently now, not the timid dimpling of fry too small to trust their own bodies, but the confident roll of fish with weight behind them, muscle earned through a winter that should have killed them twice over. He took to standing at the bank longer than he needed to, not out of pride exactly, but out of the same quiet accounting a man does when he's spent a long time waiting to see if a thing would live. By early summer he was netting a few for the smoker, and even then his hands paused before the knife, surprised each time by the density of them, the clean pink flesh, the fat along the belly that spoke of a pond doing exactly what a pond was supposed to do, feeding, sheltering, balancing itself the way he'd nudged it to. He didn't talk about it much. He never had been a man for talking. But the valley had its own way of moving information, slow and sideways, through the kind of channels that didn't need a phone line. It started at church, the way most things did, a farmer's wife mentioning to another that her husband had seen trout jumping in that old pond up past the Hollis place, big ones, bigger than anything coming out of the hatchery these days. Then it moved to the market, where the feed store clerk who'd once laughed at buckets of dying fry found himself repeating the story to a customer without quite remembering when he'd stopped finding it funny. Someone said the old man had a gift. Someone else said it was just luck, the kind that runs out eventually. But the hushed conversations kept circling back to the same detail, spoken almost reverently now. The fish the hatchery threw away were thriving in a ditch pond nobody thought could hold water, let alone life. He heard fragments of it secondhand, a neighbor mentioning it at the fence, the diner waitress asking if it was true he had trout the size of a man's forearm, and he'd nod, non-committal, and go back to whatever chore had his hands that day. He wasn't chasing recognition. He'd learned long ago that recognition came slow to men like him, if it came at all. But the pond kept doing what it did, indifferent to gossip, and the fish kept growing, and somewhere down in the valley, word was traveling faster than he ever could have pushed it himself. The writer showed up on a Tuesday, driving a station wagon with a cooler of notebooks and cameras rattling in the back seat, the kind of car that looked like it had covered every back road in 3 states, looking for stories nobody else would bother telling. He'd heard about the pond from a fishing guide 2 counties over, who'd heard it from a man at a gas station, who'd heard it from someone who swore his cousin had caught a trout there, heavier than any hatchery fish had business being. The writer found the veteran mending a fence post, unhurried, and introduced himself with the kind of polite persistence that comes from years of being told no and driving on anyway. The old man didn't say much at first. He answered questions the way he did everything, carefully, without waste, letting silences sit until they'd earned their answer. But when the writer asked to see the pond, he set down his tools and walked him out past the shed, past the aerator still humming low and steady, to the water itself. The trout came up when he knelt at the edge, the way they always did, sensing him before they saw him, and the writer went quiet in a way that told the old man he understood something words couldn't quite carry. He photographed the pond in the low gold light of early evening, the water calm on top and churning with shadow beneath, and he wrote down details the old man gave without embellishment: the feeding schedule, the shade cloth, the long night during the cold snap when he'd broken ice by hand, rather than lose what he'd promised himself he wouldn't lose again. The writer asked why he'd bothered saving fish nobody else wanted. The old man thought about it a long moment, looking out over the water, and said simply that he'd learned a long time ago not to leave anything behind just because someone decided it wasn't worth saving. The feature ran a few weeks later, spread across 4 pages with a photograph of the pond at sunrise, mist rising off water that looked, in that light, like something out of a dream rather than a ditch runoff nobody wanted. Word moved faster than anyone expected. Trucks with out-of-state plates began appearing on the county road, anglers asking after the pond by name, buyers calling the feed store for directions, and soon enough, a familiar truck came rattling up the drive too, the hatchery's, its owner stepping out with his hat in his hands, looking for the first time less like a man who owned the valley's water and more like one asking permission to drink from it. The hatchery manager stood at the fence a long moment before he came through the gate, and when he did, he didn't say much at first. He just looked at the water. The morning light was doing what it did most mornings now, turning the pond the color of hammered tin, and beneath the surface the shapes moved the way they always moved, slow and heavy and sure of themselves, trout that had grown fat and strong on scraps of patience nobody had thought to spend on them. By then there were others at the fence too, the feed store clerk with a cooler and a checkbook, a woman from 2 towns over with a camera around her neck, a line of trucks parked crooked along the shoulder of the county road like it was auction day. Cash changed hands in folded bills. Someone asked to take a photograph of the old man standing by the water, and he obliged, though he didn't smile much for it, just stood there in his worn jacket with the net in his hand like he'd stood there every morning for a year. The hatchery manager watched all of it. He watched the net dip and rise, watched the old man's careful hands sort fish the way he always had, unhurried, deliberate, the same rhythm that had looked like foolishness in the fall and looked like mastery now. When he finally spoke, it wasn't much. An offer, something about a partnership, splitting stock, putting the old man's name on a sign by the hatchery gate. The old man listened, the way he listened to everything, without interrupting, and then he shook his head, not unkindly, and said he didn't need his name on anything. He said the pond had never needed a partner. It had only ever needed somebody willing to wait. The manager stood there a while longer, hat in his hands, and didn't argue. There wasn't much left to argue. The water had already said what it needed to say. By evening the trucks had thinned out, the money was in a coffee can on the kitchen table, and the pond had gone quiet again, mist gathering low over the surface the way it always did when the temperature dropped. The old man walked the fence line one more time before dark, same as he had for years, checking the aerator, checking the shade cloth, checking nothing in particular except that everything was where it belonged. The next morning he was up before the sun, same as always, moving down toward the water with a bucket in his hand and the cold biting at his knuckles. The fish rose to meet him the way they always did, unbothered by newspapers or cameras or the noise that had come and gone. He fed them like it was any other day, because to him it was.